Alright, good evening. Welcome to the Mars Hill House of Intellectual Discourse. My name is Joshua Johnson, and we're continuing our study of Rethinking Reality, a study of Jonathan Edwards' philosophy through a study of George Berkeley's dialogues. And tonight we're going to be delving into the book, into arguments dealing with creation and more areas of Christian theology. You'll see philonous and hylas continue in Hylas' attack or offensive on philonous, which is sort of the current focus right now. Is that we got a commenter tonight, but Hylas is on the offensive. He wants to critique philonous. He wants to show that philonous' system is liable to the same objections that his former system was. Hylas believed in matter, affirmed it to be true, was very confident in it. Philonous was able to tear it down and lead him towards a path towards skepticism. And so Hylas, instead of accepting other premises like the existence of God and things like that, Hylas says, well, I can show you that your belief in God, your belief in these things, is just as unfounded as my belief in matter once was. I want to validate or vindicate the position of skepticism. So that's the position being argued for by Hylas, and he's doing it by attempting to trap and critique Philonous, the one who initially trapped and critiqued him in earlier dialogues. And so I want to do a brief review of the last study. I'm not going to do a full review of the whole thing. I've talked to some of the new people who are here outside of the study to get them kind of up to date with what we're discussing. But with the last study, we had several different points that got brought up by Hylas and his objections to Philonous. The first one is called non-vertical images, which I had up here last week, the moon and the ore. And the moon and the ore was his analogy to make this criticism. Hylas goes, okay, well, if these things exist in our mind, and that's what they really are, how do you explain illusions, essentially? Or what, actually, in this sense, the non-vertical images, which is objects that look different, but upon further examination, their appearance changes. An example of this would be an ore in the water. When it's in the water, it appears bent. But then you pull it out of the water, it's straight. Now, Hylas' criticism of Philonous was, okay, well, if the ore exists in our mind, and that's what it is, then when you see it bent, that's how it really is. That was his criticism. Now, this is attempted criticism. He's saying that, well, Philonous, that's absurd. It's absurd to say that's how the ore really is, because we all know that the ore is really straight. It only appears bent in the water. But see, the trick here is he's assuming the position to be proven. Okay? So, you get a straight ore there. It looks more like a leg or a spoon or something. But anyway, in the criticism, it assumes that the image has a constant nature despite of the way it appears to us. Whereas Philonous sees the criticism right away for what it is. And he says, well, actually, no, you have to go with what your senses are telling you. Is the ore bent when you're looking at it? Yes. So the problem isn't what is the ore really, it's the inferences you make from that. So when you see the ore bent in the water, you really are seeing a bent ore. That's what you're seeing. That's plain. Where the fallacy comes in is when you infer then and say, well, once you add a second sensation, like you start touching the ore and running your arm down it, that it will feel bent as well. That'd be a false inference, because that won't happen. And it's also a false inference to make to say that just because it appears bent, that once I lift it out of the water, it'll remain appearing bent. That was the error. The error isn't that you're mistaking what you're seeing for what it really is. No, what you're seeing is the way it really is as it is appearing to you. The ore is bent. That's how it looks. The false inference is saying that when you add a second element to the matter, that it will remain the same. That is, if you pull the ore out, will it stay bent? No. If you put your hand down the ore, will it feel bent? No. Those are false inferences. That's the error that's being made. That is sort of the conclusion that he draws against Hylas, is saying your objection fails because it assumes what's to be proven, that objects have a nature independent of our senses. That is begging the question. Rather, go with plain common sense. Does it appear bent? Yes. Does it continue to appear bent when you pull it out? No. That's plain Jane simple. And that's the way he deals with that first objection. So then you get to the creator-creature distinction. Now this is a distinction that exists in Reformed theology, which Bishop Berkeley clearly holds to the Calvinistic leanings. And in this distinction, he stresses that God knows things in a different way than when we know them. We might know the same exact, we might be looking at the exact same thing, but it's different as God experiences the way we experience it, just because of the difference between God and man. And so an example that hylas tries to do to kind of usurp this and critique philonous is he says, okay, well, you're saying that I have experiences of pain, and pain is an imperfection. Well, if God has the experience of pain first, and gives it to me, and if God experiences pain and it's an imperfection, then God is imperfect. And you claim, philonous, that you're a Christian, you're defending the Christian faith. If God experiences pain, that is, pain exists in his mind in that sense, then you would have to deny his imperfection. It's a good criticism. It's a neat challenge. But that's when philonous relies on that key Christian belief. He says, the reason pain as an experience is an imperfection for humans is because we are victims of pain. That is, we receive the sensation of pain. It doesn't originate in us. We receive the sensation of pain, and we're oppressed by it. We don't want it. It's afflicting us. All right? When pain exists in God, that is, when he experiences pain, he has dominion over it because he is the originator of pain. He is the one he's the originator of all things, the one who out of his breath and his decree all things come. That is the reason why in the creator-creature distinction you see that pain is different for God as he experiences than the way that we experience it, because he's eternal and infinite, but the minds of men are not. And so we receive sensations, we receive experiences. God is the originator, he brings forth experiences. And so you see that there's a distinction between the two. And so you can't take our experience and say, well, it originated in the mind of God, therefore God experiences it in the exact same way that we do. That would be a false deduction to make, because God and man are not the same. So the third objection was a stupid objection. And actually, these last two are both pretty stupid on the part of hylas, but he's reaching for something. In this one, he says, well, God and matter are really just the same thing. Because you're saying that God is the cause of the things that are in our mind. I'm saying that matter is the cause of the things that are in our mind. We're really just using the same, different words for the same thing. And this is where philonous goes through some logic and says, actually, no, they're very different. Because you're saying that matter, okay, is extended. You're saying that it has extendable properties, it's in space, whereas God is immaterial, or which is probably a bad word in this context, but unextended, yes, or spirit, exactly as the confession says. Okay, the second thing that is that God is, well, he'll say that matter is inactive. God is active. And how he demonstrates this, well, first of all, he goes off the Christian assumption. Okay, well, you're already saying that matter is extended things out there, like they're particles or something, or some sort of underlying substance. I'm already denying that God's like them, saying that God is spirit, he's infinite, he doesn't have those sorts of boundaries. So there's already that distinction, but he also says that another way that you err in saying that we're referring to the same thing is, I'm saying that matter can't be a cause, but God can be. And here's why. Matter is inactive, but now something is actively causing our experiences to come into our minds. Matter can't do that if it cannot act, if it's inert. How can it be the cause? How can it bring forth experiences into our mind? It can't. But God can, because he's active. In fact, you can deduce backwards and say, okay, I have experiences, something is actively causing them into my mind. That automatically precludes the possibility of matter, but it does say that God is a possible conclusion. And if you follow the chains, you will get God very clearly. And so he starts with that. He says, okay, well, God is active in doing this. If he's active in deciding what I have versus what I don't have, he has a will, a volition, etc., etc., etc. There's a very big difference. Whereas matter cannot explain. It cannot explain the fact that I have experiences in my mind. And it cannot be the cause of them. There's no necessity for it. But there is a necessity for saying that God is the cause of our experiences. He can be, matter cannot. We are not referring to the same thing, hylas. That is what philonous' conclusion is. You're playing games now. So then the fourth point is really his clever little attempt to slip stuff in. He says, well, everybody knows that in gravity, in the law of gravitation, an object based on the amount of matter in it, this will be the key word, that will decide the rate at which it falls. Doesn't that prove matter? Because objects have certain levels of density and fall at certain rates. But the problem is he's equivocating on the word matter. By equivocate, I mean that he is using matter in two different ways. He'll use matter to refer to this underlying substance to all things, but in gravity, he's using matter to refer to atoms, the amount of atoms in a certain object, but they're not the same thing. And philonous catches him on this. He says, you're slipping in a term and using it incorrectly. You're begging the question. You're trying to prove matter, and you do that by assuming it in your argument. And you're using the definition of matter that doesn't even apply to this. So I have no doubt that objects have a certain level of density, sensible quality of density, but you're saying matter's not sensible. You're trying to slip it in there, hylas, I'm not letting you do it. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what the conclusion is. And so in all this, you see that hylas is on the offensive. He's really trying to get at something here. The first two objections are good objections, and philonous gives really good responses, and then the next two are really just crappy. Hylas gives really crappy objections. He's just reaching out of somewhere for something, and philonous just immediately blows it out of the water. And so we're continuing on to see, we're going to get, like I said, in more depth with creation and into Christian theology even deeper. We've already discussed it a little bit with creator-creature distinction, things of that sort. And so now we're getting deeper into the doctrine of creation and decrees and things like that. And that's going to be an interesting thing to study, because we're going to see how Edwards pairs up his philosophy, him and Berkeley's, to the teachings of the Westminster Confession in later studies. And so I'm really excited about that, but let's get to the reading. All right, welcome back. We just completed the reading. And it was a long reading, but it was a very interesting reading to see the continued debate between hylas and philonous. And in this section, we got to see some really strong arguments that are even a problem to this day in philosophy, which one of them is appearance versus reality, which has to do with, is there a real object there, or in relation to the images that we're having in our head, or is our images just a representation of that? Or is the appearance is a reality? What's going on here? Then the second point here is that different objects, different minds, and we get into that here. And then we get into some theological questions, which some of them are still relevant issues. This last one particularly is that is God's eternal knowledge of something versus the relative knowledge of it, that is the event of creation versus his eternal knowledge of that event. So these things are important questions, and we're going to delve into them. The first one is sort of the beginning arguments and debate. It was more of the philosophical, this more epistemological. They were debating about the nature of things. And it was on the appearance versus reality. You get this brought up from the very beginning. Hylas goes, well, you want to change things into ideas. That's sort of how he starts it off. You're wanting to change all real things into being ideas. You make them into an empty shell of appearances. And philonous criticizes this, and he goes, does anybody have an idea of what was his objection to this? How did philonous respond?
I don't remember.
Well, I'll just throw it out to you real quick. The way he responds to this is he goes, nonsense. I actually make ideas to be things. I show you that you have that these, basically you have mental content.
Right. He says, I'm not for changing things into ideas, but rather ideas into things, since those immediate objects of perception, which according to you are not only appearances of things, I take to be the real things themselves.
Absolutely. That's really important. He's saying that the chair is not just an appearance of a chair, of which there's something underlying it, of which that appearance represents. Rather, he's saying, when I see a chair, that's the chair. That's the object. And the sensations exist in my mind, the chair exists in my mind, but that's the real chair. There's no distinction. There's no, I have an idea in my head that represents a real thing out there somewhere, I know not what. That doesn't vary or change at all. So he's trying to show that you're mistaking my notions here. And in fact, this objection can be turned back on you. You say, or want to say, that it has this underlying substance, and that the images that we have in our head are just some sort of representation. But here's what the problem is. He says, if this is the case, how can we know that our knowledge is reliable? This is the problem with Immanuel Kant, who came later. Immanuel Kant responded to Hume, who grossly misresponded to Berkeley. And Kant's view said that we have sensations come into our head. Our mind is what makes the reality. Our mind makes the objects. They're not presented as is. Our mind actually makes them. And basically those sensations come from out there somewhere. We know not where, and we know not what they represent or what they're from. All we know is the content of our own heads. And so what the conclusion was is that the images in my head, the phenomenal reality, does not necessarily reflect the noumenal. Okay, the noumenal was things as they are. We can never know that. It's unknowable. Okay, and this is sort of, Berkeley's kind of anticipating Immanuel Kant here. He's saying, actually guys, you're, hylas, you're actually saying that all our knowledge is mental content. You don't deny this, but you believe it represents something you cannot know. If that's the case, then you don't know anything, because your knowledge is a representation of something you could never know. So basically, when you see a chair, you don't really know if it accurately represents what's really out there. The image in your head of a chair could be representing a rock, for all you know, or a void, or a woman. You don't know. All you know is the representation in your head, and you believe it represents something out there that you cannot know, or can never know. How is that helpful? Does not lead to skepticism, he says, to the most absurd skepticism, and it did. Immanuel Kant's philosophy is the predominant philosophy in understanding metaphysics and the nature of reality. It has predominated in society. And it's led to skepticism. They've questioned, okay, well, God can't exist, okay, because we can't really know if he exists. We can't really know if there's matter. We don't understand. Because we can't get outside of the contents of our own head. And that's sort of something he's anticipating here. So it's a serious, serious problem. And so philosophy says, why would you even make that kind of assumption? Why would you make the assumption that there's something unknowable out there outside of our knowledge? We can only know the content of our own knowledge. There's no reason to think, there's no reason to believe that it comes from an unknowable source. That's a faulty assumption. Rather, we know what we have. We have an object, we have a chair is a chair. It is what it is. Simple. It's not the chair representing an unknowable variable. And so, go with what's plain to common sense on that notion. And he says there's no reason to assume otherwise. And so, the second thing that we see is different objects, different minds. Did anybody understand this argument? On the part of hylas? He says it's about the sameness issue. We both claim to perceive the same object, but your mind's different from my mind. So you have an object in your head, I have an object in my head. They're not the same. They can't be the same unless that object had a fixed, absolute existence independent of both of us. That's the objection Hylas is bringing up. It's very clever.
Right.
But what is philonous? How does he answer this?
No, he says, we do not see the same object that we feel, neither the same object perceived by a microscope, which was by the naked eye.
Correct. Now let me speak on that real quick. Okay, so what this means is very clear. Okay, so let's say I look at, okay, I'll say someone's finger. That's a really funny finger. Okay, there's a fingernail there, and you got like a wrinkly knuckle thing going. Okay, that's a really terrible finger, but okay, that's a finger.
It looks really bad.
Okay.
Please.
It's actually not that bad.
No.
Alright, whatever. Okay.
Draw a rock.
I think the finger was better. That looks more like a tooth than a rock.
Alright, forget it. I'm gonna draw a tree.
Yeah, you can't mess up a tree. Surely. You can't. What kind of tree is that? Oh my goodness gracious.
What? It's broccoli.
It's broccoli.
Go with it.
Alright, so let's say we go with the tree. And we decide to take a microscope to this one section. Now we're going to have an open slide here. And now what we see is, we'll say, plant cells. Okay, something like that. Anyway, so now you have the tree, which is perceived by plain sight. Okay, now this is dealing with this objection. Now, this is leading up to a second objection, but this one here is to give an example. So when we perceive the tree, okay, we perceive it by plain sight, the object. Now, do we perceive a different object when we use a microscope? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not looking at this image anymore. That image is not what's in the microscope. There's a different image there. We perceive a different object. That's what's plain issue here. Now, what's the connection here? He says, The reason we connect the two is that every time I apply a microscope to this tree, this is the image I get. Okay? So, and I get smaller and smaller, I get more and more images. But you can't say at the same time that my finger is identical to the constituent atoms. So, they're different, because if you get those images, the two images are different. They're different objects. They're different ideas. However, if I apply a microscope to this idea, I get this one. They're always connected. That's how I develop my laws. That's how it says you develop laws. You say, okay, well, I understand that by the law of nature that a living organism is made up of cells. And I know that because, but that statement is actually, what it really means is that every time, now this is the literal meaning of that law, every time you apply a microscope to a living organism, you see the object of cells. So it actually, and that's what the law is really saying. You're saying that you're connecting different objects. You're saying every time I look at one object under a microscope, this object appears. Now maybe one day I might look at you in a microscope, and for some reason I might see little tooth fairies. No, hopefully not. That'd be kind of weird. But the point is that that would be contrary to a normal experience. Okay, and that would violate the law as we've observed it. The law is describing an observation, a connection of events. What we're seeing is that every time you look at a tree in that certain way, you see these cells. So you write up a law that says trees are made up of cells. It's because of a connection of ideas, different objects. And the reason this is important is this applies to different minds. I'll explain why this is a problem. Okay, so let's say you guys are both looking at me, which you are. Okay, the way that you look at me, that is, I'll put this J, M, okay. Now the way, let's say the angle you're looking at might be like a regular stick figure, and let's say this would be an exaggeration. I'm more at my side, okay. So from the way, the image in one person's head is a straight-on image. In the other person, it's an angle, so you see a side profile. Okay? The images are different. Now this is where hylas' criticism comes in. Are they looking at the same thing? There's two different images. There's two different ideas in his mind and their mind. So are they looking at different things? Are they different ideas? Now this is where you get to the word same. What does it mean? And this is very clever on the part of philonous. The issue is with the word same. The reason it is because they're using same in the vulgar sense. If you use same in the common Joe sense, there's a similarity between the ideas, and this is based on how God tends to reveal it, and that if you take, and this is why he brought up two people that didn't have the use of language, that they could both be pointing at something and agree on what it is, and say, okay, this is the same thing. And that's because God, under Berkeley's system, has so ordained it that the perceptions line up in such a way that you can have speech. But I would like for it to say, it would be, and this is why he brings up why human language would be inadequate if we didn't do it this way, because it'd be wrong for this individual to say, I am viewing front Josh, you're viewing side Josh, they're different Joshes. You know, front Josh and side Josh, and backwards Josh, why don't you just say Josh? And that's sort of where you get into this. And I see Josh from this angle, you see Josh from another angle. The human language has developed to accommodate the fact that you have different perceptions of an individual. And so this is where you get, like I said, the issue the same. Because in the philosophical sense, you get a problem. The philosophical sense, he says, is this abstract, silly sense where you're saying that it has to have this absolute identity independent of any mind perceiving it. He goes, and you want to attribute it to matter, which you can't define anyway. If you want this identity so much, just say it exists in the mind of God. God knows Josh truly and absolutely. We all know Josh in a relative sense. You know Josh from his front profile and his side profile, but you don't know me in the same way that my wife knows me. Clearly. And that's with anything. People don't know me like my mother knows me. There's different knowledge, and God gives different knowledge to different individuals. He gives a different knowledge to me. He reveals me to my wife in a different way than you. In an intimate way and things like that. I mean, you see that in Scripture. In the Hebrew, a man would go into his wife. It actually says a man knew his wife. The word knowledge in the Hebrew is used for that. And it's because you have gained both perceptual knowledge from that sexual intimacy and also knowing her more personally, you've gained knowledge. God has revealed that woman to you in a different way than other men have. So you know her in a way that other men do not. So, God knows me in the most truest and absolute sense. So if you're looking for an absolute identity, that's in God. But God gives you different images of me. People know me differently. They know different Joshes in a sense. And that's sort of the issue that Philonous is objecting to against Hylas. He says, well, actually, you're right. There are different objects. You're looking at a different Josh than I am. But the reason we call it same is because God has revealed it in such a way that we would use language in order to say that they're the same person, and because the absolute notion of Josh exists in the mind of God. So, now we move down from these more philosophical arguments into discussion of creation. Now, Hylas is convinced that the doctrine of creation is inconsistent with Philonous' system that denies matter and that things are just revealed to the mind. And the first objection is extremely good. It is a very good objection. He says, well, if in the beginning, God created these things, but no one was there to perceive it, then how can you say that it existed? How can you agree with the account of Moses? Mm-hmm. How can you agree with that? I mean, you're saying that everything exists in the mind, but there was no minds perceiving it except God. And you would have to make, unless you say that there was no creation, it was just his eternal knowledge of it, how would you explain that? And Philonous gives a good objection. And it's an appeal to something that Hylas has to account for. Hylas, he goes, well, first of all, you can't make that criticism, that dogmatic criticism against me, unless you can demonstrate that there were no created spirits at that time.
Sorry.
Like angels. Did angels perceive the creation of the universe prior to man? There's reason to believe it. If that's the case, then you can still say that creation had an in-time relative existence when it was created into the minds of those spirits. That was Philonous' objection. He goes, you have to prove that to me first. Prove to me that there were no created spirits. There's a strong reason to believe in the history of Christian orthodoxy that there were angels at that time, and they did perceive that event. And then men perceived the rest of the created event, and so on and so forth. And so, you can't tell me that, okay, there is no relative creation in time because there was no minds there, because there could have been. There very well could have been. And so, but that distinction you see between eternal and created is here. So yeah, there could have been minds, there could have been that relative creation. Well now, Hylas wants to continue pushing that further. He goes, and this is probably one of the most difficult areas in Christian theology. I would argue it's probably the most. The relationship between God and time. It's a very difficult issue. And it gets difficult when you discuss God's omniscience, because you can have potential problems. And this is where you get to Hylas' objection. There's a series of objections under this, but one of the objections was the difference between an eternal and relative creation. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, he says, well, God has always known about the creation. Creation has always existed in his mind in a sense, because there was never a time when he didn't know about creation in its totality. It's eternally known. If it wasn't, he would have to have learned it, which means that God learns and he's not omniscient. That'd be a problem. So he had to have eternally known creation. It has always existed in his mind. Now this is where he's trying to get at Philonous, because Philonous says that everything exists in minds. Therefore he's trying to say that there is no such thing as a creation distinct from the eternal creation. Now if he makes this argument, then he's going to try to trap Philonous from a literal reading of creation and time. Yeah. So, but this is what Philonous objects. He goes, yeah, there's the eternal creation that existed in his mind, but then when that content of his mind was revealed to the minds of angels and men, then we properly say that it was in time. There's a distinction. There's how it's eternally known in his mind, and then that's how it's relatively known as we experience it, and there's a distinction. Our knowledge of creation is different from God's knowledge of creation. It exists in his mind, it always has, he doesn't learn, but we did learn it. There was someone who learned about creation, whether man or angel.
Isn't God outside time?
Correct. Correct. And that's, you get into, it's not as easy to use that term as you would think. Because outside connotates that time is a finite space, and then God is outside of it like this. And then you get into a lot of discussion. It gets into deep stuff, like A series versus B series time. It gets really, really interesting. And the traditional view of first originated St. Augustine, who actually used that phrase, that God is outside of time. He perceives the beginning and the end all at once. And this is where you get the idea of existing in his mind. Because if you say God's outside of time, okay, that is, time has beginning and end, so it's spatial like this. If God's outside of it, then it exists in him. You get the same conclusion as it existing in his mind, because God is a mind.
Well, again, our finite minds, you can't totally understand.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the point. And that's where you get to, that's where philonous finally draws the line on this. He says, because hylas presses the point. Okay, he goes, oh, okay. You're saying that there's eternally created, and then there's created in the minds of men and stuff. Okay. But God eternally knew that he was going to create in our minds, so then he presses that distinction even further. And philonous isn't dealing with it. He says, look, you're getting into an incomprehensible truth here. One that is apprehended by faith alone. And that, he goes, even if you believe in matter, you're not going to solve the problem any more than anyone else. It's going to be a problem just as much for you as it is for me. Because let's say you do believe in the existence of matter. The fact of the matter is, if you were to say that, okay, and hylas admits this, he does believe that God eternally knew of creation. If you believe that he created then a material world, okay, distinct from his eternal knowledge, there's a problem. He would either not know the difference between the two. That is, God couldn't tell the difference between his physical creation and the eternal creation in his mind. Because if he did know the difference, and one started, that means he learned about it. That means that knowledge began at a certain point. If it began at a certain point, then he learned, and therefore he's imperfect. If he can't tell the difference between the two, then you're basically saying God is dumb, and he can't tell the difference between when he created and when he eternally knew of it. So you got a serious dilemma. It's no different for the materialist than it is for the person who is an immaterialist. The fact of the matter is, God eternally knew of the created order. At some point it comes into our minds, that's the best we can do. Because, as he says, we are finite minds trying to comprehend the eternal. We cannot fully grasp it. And he goes, it's just as much of a problem for you as it for me. I don't see why you're even bothering with the point. In fact, you see philonous asks you, what are you doing here? What are you doing with this? Why are you even bringing this up?
Is he asking a stupid question? Like, similar to, can God create a rock too big he can't lift it? You know, because...
No, I disagree. I don't think they're the same.
Who are our finite minds along the line of our finite minds can only understand the infinite to a point.
But I think there's a difference with the old question. Well, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? I would just say no. He can't. I have no problem saying he can't do something because he cannot violate his own nature. He cannot do something contrary to being a mind, being infinite, etc. He cannot cease his own existence. I would say it's absurd. I don't believe in God. Some people will say, well, God's independent, he can just do whatever he wants, but that's not the meaning of omnipotence. Omnipotence is all-powerful, and the way that Scripture defines all-powerful is that nothing has power over him. He is the supreme over all things. That is, he has no dependency on anything. All things depend upon him. So to ask that question, well, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it, is to not understand the definition of the term omnipotence as Scripture states it. God has no dependency on anything but himself. And so, I have no objection to saying that, no, of course he can't do that. He can't sin either. He can't do anything contrary to his own nature. And because that would violate the very definition of what it is to be God. And so that's sort of how you have to answer that. But the difference with this isn't making that argument. This isn't one saying that, questioning God's nature. What this is saying is how can we understand the idea of a temporal creation versus his eternal knowledge of it without either A, making God stupid, or B, making God change. If we make God change, we violate his nature, which would be a problem. And if we make God stupid, that would violate his nature. It seems to be a dilemma. However, we can only go with what we know. And this is what's important. Because we only experience things in a succession of duration, or a succession of moments, also known as duration. If that's the way we experience things in a sequence of events, time, then that's how we have to interpret things. We can only understand eternity from this perspective. So it's not a cop-out. He's not saying, it's just a mystery. He's not making that objection. You got to be careful on this. When he says it's incomprehensible, it's not saying that we can't understand it to an extent. He's just saying that we can't have a comprehensive knowledge of it simply because of how we stand. For instance, the United States government is trillions of dollars in debt. I understand that, but I don't comprehend that number. I don't comprehend trillions of dollars. I understand it, and there's a difference. Similarly, I can say that the constituent properties of the world is atoms. Okay, if I take a microscope and I look at a rock, I will see atoms. And so theoretically, you could say that if, based on what we believe we know about the Earth, the way we've perceived it, let's say you took a measurement, we say, well, the Earth is so many, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles in diameter, and take that cubic measurement and try to divide it about the amount of atoms. Okay, I could maybe theoretically understand that concept, that that there's that many atoms there. I could never comprehend that. You can tell me there's billions of people here. I can't comprehend that. I can understand it. There's a very big difference. There's a difference between understanding what is being said and fully comprehending all of it. There's a difference. And so, when it comes to the eternal creation and relative creation, we can understand the concept to a degree. We can understand the idea that God could not have learned something new when He created the world. He could not have. If He learned something new, He changes. He's not a non-changing God. He learns. He's not omniscient. Serious theological problems. And so, that can be a problem. However, from our finite perspective, we know that He did it. We know that something originated in time, that we began experiencing it the way that we do. So we know that something happened. Okay, there was a creation event. And we also know that it eternally exists in His mind. And that's about as far as we can go. And we can understand it. But to go beyond that and try to comprehend it, it's like being able to count from 1 to 1 trillion. I can understand trillion. I'm not counting it. I'd be dead before I even got halfway.
So understanding isn't equal with comprehension?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because, that's like using the word comprehensive. You can have a comprehensive understanding versus a general understanding. And there's certain things that we can only have a general understanding of. And this is sort of what philonous is appealing to. He's not simply saying it's a cop-out mystery. He's saying that based on our perspective and our limited powers of learning, we can only have a general understanding of this concept. And basically what hylas is trying to do is demand from philonous a comprehensive explanation of this. He says it's impossible. You can't do it either. Oh, good point. And then that settles it. And that's as far as we are. Now, I want to ask you guys, throw some questions at me. I mean, this is getting into some heavy Christian theology.
I don't know, the time issue is still something that just kind of blows my mind.
It is.
And I don't really understand it.
No, it gets really difficult. Are you saying just in general, or are you saying specifically in this issue?
Both.
Yeah.
Do they know when the angels were created at all? Does it give any kind of...
There's a general... I think there's clues that they preceded man. Man was made a little less than the angels, so it sort of assumes that they were already existing, because we're made less than them. So the concept of angel at least existed in the mind of God, or they did exist, because that's sort of, that discusses that in the Psalms, that, you made him a little less than one divine. So how would you attribute that? So, and I think that's a good point, that we could actually say that, yeah, then there's a very good possibility there was angels before men, perceiving the creation event. It would make sense for God to do that anyway, so because they would give glory to Him the whole time, singing His praises as He created the world. It's very in keeping with His character to do something like that.
Your answer to both your questions, saying the Bible says, the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom. And I think in Psalms, it mentions, your ways are higher than my ways.
Yeah.
Who can, Psalm 139, creating a most being, knit you together by a mother's womb. In the Old Testament it says, God says to Moses, tell people I am.
Yeah.
you know, so it goes, and it also can be in Romans 9. It all goes back to accepting that God is so much fill in the blank than we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and the emphasis is on that his sovereignty, his self-existence is really what's being questioned here. And hylas, I think, eventually is going to be pushed back and say, okay, well, I'm not going to give you a question that I myself can't answer either, that no one could ever answer, so why even bring it up? It's not really relevant to the discussion anymore. It's not, you're no longer, I mean, this question is no longer relevant to whether matter exists. It really isn't, because it's a problem for both in an equally strong sense. The problem is, and I don't know if this will help you, Jared, if I reiterate just a tiny bit on it, is that God has an eternal knowledge of creation. There was never a time in eternity when he didn't know about it fully.
Right, I understand that.
Okay, so when he created it, he couldn't have learned anything new. Now, but here's the thing, so you have his eternal knowledge from here, and then we'll have the actual event of creation, if we're going to say it's distinct from his eternal knowledge. Okay, if he didn't learn anything new, then he can't tell the difference between these two. He can't tell the difference between his eternal knowledge of creation and then when he actually did it.
Why?
Because the knowledge would be the same. If his eternal knowledge is over here and this is his created knowledge. So if there's no change. If there's no distinction, there has to be a distinction. If you're going to say that he knows a distinction. So for instance, if I know I know that room's there, for instance. This is the difference between me and God on this. Okay? I know that room's there. Okay? I have a knowledge of it in my head. Okay? We'll say that's my eternal knowledge as an analogy. Now I go into that room. Okay? Is the knowledge I had in my head before I went in there different? If they were exactly the same, I wouldn't be able to know that I walked into the room. I wouldn't know they were different events. I have the exact knowledge of the room in my head, and then I go in the room and there's knowledge of that room. They'd be perfectly the same thing. I wouldn't know the difference.
Well, but this is man versus God.
You're right.
God can determine and understand some of this stuff, and then you got different things like the angels were saying was probably present there and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, that was this one. This is the issue between eternal creation and then the actual event of creation. Eternal creation is like his eternal knowledge of it. Okay, there wasn't a time when he didn't know about creation.
Well, the event of creation is basically isn't like an action, more or less. It's the revealing of it to us. In reality, we are time. Our minds are what create time.
In a sense,
without us, there's no time.
Because we're the only ones who really experience it in that sense. God experiences in an eternal sense. That's why they say he's outside of time.
So without our minds, there is no time.
That's
so
a common belief.
Essentially, we are time.
Martin Heidegger actually had that view, working off of St. Augustine's philosophy.
Or like I said before, I keep it even simpler. It's just accepted by faith.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree with that conclusion. I agree. I'm just trying to unpack what the actual criticism is.
Oh.
Okay? And the actual criticism is that if these two are different, if eternal knowledge is different from the event of creation, okay, so are we saying that his eternal knowledge, okay, K, applying to the E, his eternal knowledge, is it distinct from his knowledge of the event? Okay, well, so the event of creation. Okay, so you have the event of creation and you have eternal creation. Okay, his knowledge, if different, remember the event happened in time.
Yeah, but you keep referring to it as an action, like
I know, no.
Doing it,
no,
like,
I'm sympathetic to your position, but I'm referring to Hylas' objection here. Okay, and how it applies to the belief in the material universe. He's saying that God has an eternal knowledge of creation, and then he also knows of his event in time creation.
When he's revealing it.
Yes, well, that's what Hylas' position is, but this isn't just revealing it. It's like the event when it happened, okay, versus how it happened in his head from eternity. And so if it happened in time, and this is different from his eternal knowledge, then at that time, that knowledge came to be, that knowledge of that temporal event. In which case, he learned something in time. Maybe only one thing, but that one thing he learned, because that was different from this. Now, if it's not, if it's just his eternal knowledge, then there's no distinction. There's no difference between the eternal and created knowledge. So either he doesn't tell the difference, or there's no temporal creation. I mean, that's part of the objection. And once again,
I think it's trying to learn what the other guy is trying to get at is what's confusing. Because if you just trying to think about what Hylas is trying to, that's what's confusing.
Yeah, because Hylas is confused. Hylas is
trying
exactly.
to think of whatever Hylas is trying to bring up is what's confusing. Because if you just think about what philonous is that God always knew it, and then he started revealing it, what he knew.
Yes, into our minds.
It's basically the only thing. He knew it all, and then he revealed it.
Right, that's Hylas' position. And yeah, I think it's simpler. And Hylas doesn't really have a position. He's just trying to criticize. That's all he's trying to do. And Hylas eventually gets fed up with him and says, look, you can't give a better answer to this. No one can, because of our finite situation. And I think from listening to you guys, you would agree with this. We're finite. This is stuff that you're really not going to get a good answer on, or we can't even begin to comprehend it. Why even bring it up? And how is this relevant to the existence of matter anyway? Even if matter existed, you wouldn't be able to give a better answer.
We try to the one person, Hylas, is trying to get an answer because we as people we throughout all creation we want to we like to be like God first and foremost, and even more so, God's created us a curiosity, adventure in our mind and in ourselves to want answers to questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a natural curiosity on the part of Hylas for this. I mean, there is definitely a motive to, I guess, understand these incomprehensible things. But part of Hylas is that he's definitely being fox-like. He's trying to be clever. He's trying to be critical. And I think in the end, he stumps himself and says, well, okay, well, I guess that was a pointless question that no one can answer. I mean, it really was. And so that's really the conclusion that has to be drawn. So, in the end, I think that Philonous does a good job. He pretty much shows that, okay, well, this belief leads to skepticism. This is a mistaken, you don't really use the word same correctly on this one. Well, you haven't proven that angels didn't exist then. And by the way, you have no answer to that problem either. So, that's his summary. He goes, you've done nothing. You have given no good objections here. You'd either lead to your own skepticism that leads to absurdity, or they're not real objections. That's all it really is. And so Philonous has continued to post good defenses against the objections of Hylas in defending the idealism of George Berkeley. So, any other questions? Okay, well, we're going to close, and thanks for coming, and see you next week.